Have you ever wondered? Ever wondered?
After earning his BA in English, Jim Matlock became interested in the claims of reincarnation and began detailed research of the topic. He soon came across the work of Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, which inspired him further. Stevenson's emphasis on careful investigation, documentation, and verification of claimed past life memories was an approach Jim found appealing, as he was already implementing this rigorous research himself. Since his initial interest in reincarnation, he has become one of the nation's leading voices on the subject. Jim received his PhD in anthropology from Southern Illinois University and now serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Scientific Exploration. In 2014, he founded the only Facebook group devoted to reincarnation using the scientific approach. It's entitled Signs of Reincarnation, Experiences, and Research. It has become the largest reincarnation group on Facebook with almost 300,000 members. Jim is also the author of I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experiences of Reincarnation, and Signs of Reincarnation, Exploring Beliefs, Cases, and Theory. In 2021, he won the Parapsychology Book Award for Signs of Reincarnation. I'm excited to have Jim with us to discuss this fascinating topic. It is so wonderful to have you here today, Jim. I'm so excited about this interview. So thank you for being our guest today.
Well, absolutely. I love to talk about this subject. I'm very glad to be here.
You are the expert in the field. So, and I want to start out by saying that your background is so fascinating. So
thank you.
You're quite a scholar. It's such a wide range of expertise. For instance, I want our guests to know you have a BA in English with, it sounds like, a minor in psychology, master's in library science, and a PhD in anthropology.
That's right.
Yeah, it's rare to find someone with so well educated with such a diverse background in various fields. So how did your educational journey lead you to study then from your anthropology degree? And I know you studied it a little before that, but your anthropology degree to the study of reincarnation.
Okay, well, actually, the reincarnation studies came before the anthropology. So let me back up to the beginning. My first choice of career was to be a writer, creative writer. And I maintained that through college. But when
you're an excellent writer, I just want to say.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's partly, I suppose, because I've been writing all my life. I wanted to be a creative writer. I've always wanted to be a professional writer, but I wanted to be a fiction writer. But I couldn't make money at it. So I graduated from college in 1977. And this is in the 1970s, in the middle of the new age sort of stuff starting, right? And so, yeah, you're right. I did my minor in psychology, and I was at Emory. And at the time, and it was late, I mean, in the early 70s, they were still teaching behaviorism in psychology. And that turned me off. I began to question all of that. And, so when I got out of college, I started reading, and the new age stuff was coming out. And so I started reading that. And that is what led me into the more serious research, like Stevenson's on reincarnation. And I found that around 1980. In the early 80s, I was beginning to get into the more academic side of things. So Ian Stevenson, he was at the University of Virginia, he was a psychiatrist there. In 1961, he went to the field. He went to India and Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it was then, looking into children who claimed to remember previous lives. So he started in 1961, a little over 60 years ago now, the modern research on reincarnation, which is what I'm engaged in. And it's been going ever since then, systematically. But anyway, once I found that research existed and that there was serious research in parapsychology, it wasn't all this new age stuff. That was me. That was it. That was, where I wanted to be. By the mid 80s, I was getting engaged with the field. I had gone to my first professional conference in 85. And when I decided to give up fiction writing, or decided I needed to do something, I needed to do another sort of writing in order to live, I was thinking, of something that interested me, right? And so I thought of reincarnation, and I didn't know anything about reincarnation at the time. But in all my reading of literature, I had noticed it coming up again and again, sometimes in a metaphorical way, rebirth, and other times in a literal way, reincarnation, And so it interested me, it intrigued me. And so I was looking in my local library. I found books on reincarnation, but in the early 1980s, there were no general books. And so I thought, well, okay, that's something I can do. Well, then by 1985, and some of your viewers may know this book. It was a book by D. Scott Rogo that came out, and this was I was prepared to review that, and so I went to this professional conference in 1985, and I went up to the editor of what I thought was the premier journal in the field. Here I am, totally new, nobody knows me, and go up and ask him, book in hand, because the author of the book, Rogo, would happen to be at the same conference. And so I asked him if he had a copy of the book, and I got one from him. So I went up, book in hand, to the editor of the journal and asked him whether I could review it for the journal. And yeah, he allowed me to. I found out later that he and Stevenson had been having a discussion of who to pick for a reviewer, and they hadn't have anybody in mind. So here I appeared right at the perfect time. But anyway, so that's sort of how I got into it. Part of this giving up fiction writing, giving up, meant that I needed to have some sort of other career. And it was clear it's going to take me a while to write and so forth. And that's what took me into the librarianship. And it also led to one of my first professional job, which was at the American Society for Psychical Research, which took me deeper into parapsychology and made all these connections and everything. But doing that made me realize that I really wanted to do my own research. I mean, I really enjoyed being a librarian and helping people, but I wanted to do my own research. And so I started thinking about what I could do for a PhD field. And I did not want to go back into psychology because of the behaviors and this stuff. So I chose anthropology, which actually is a very good field for this. And part of the reason that I did is when Stevenson studied these cases, he studied them all over the world. So it just seemed natural when I started reading, because I had my interest in reincarnation at this point. So I was focused on reincarnation in my anthropological reading and research. And one of the things I noticed very quickly is that around the world, you have tribal societies, indigenous societies that have reincarnation beliefs. And where you find reincarnation beliefs, you find the same sorts of things that Stevenson was studying.
Wow.
Yeah. And so what that told me is that reincarnation, the whole belief in reincarnation, was probably based on these sorts of signs. And hence the name of my book, Signs of Reincarnation. These sorts of signs, that's what they're called in anthropology, signs.
I want to talk about a little bit about your view of consciousness, because I think that's pretty fundamental. If there is such a thing as reincarnation, then consciousness must be, separate from the physical brain. Tell us about your processional theory. Is that how you...
Processual soul theory. Let's start with soul. I mean, one of the questions that I asked myself in writing the book, in the course of developing those lectures, the first thing I had to ask myself is what it is that reincarnates. People say it's the soul. What is the soul, right? I mean, what is the soul? It's a religious concept. I read an article by a physicist called Henry Stapp, who wrote about how consciousness could survive death and how that made sense in terms of quantum theory. Okay? And that was my aha moment. I thought, the soul is consciousness, or at least what we can say as far as survival of death and reincarnation goes, what matters is consciousness. That was my first thing. And then from there, it sort of just fell into place. One of the things I realized was that consciousness, as I say, is sort of duplex. That a lot of people think of consciousness as just our conscious awareness, right? The top level of where we're aware, we're thinking, and they forget about the subconscious level. We're all aware we have a subconscious, right? There is stuff going on underneath the conscious level. And when we're sleeping, we're not conscious, right? I mean, and consciously aware, but we're still living, right? We still have this. So obviously, to me, at least, there was a consciousness going on anytime somebody was living, even when they were sleeping or, in coma or whatever. This is consciousness. Consciousness is what survives death. Now, this idea that's not original to me. This is a major parapsychological position that consciousness is separate from the body. So that idea of consciousness being separate in the body is not new. But thinking of it as in terms of reincarnation made everything fall into place for me.
Because would you say, I think from the wonderful things you've written, that's where is imprinted the things that are passed on in the did you call it subliminal?
The subliminal or subconscious part. Yeah, I mean, that's where I think materialists, psychologists, neuroscientists like to think of memory as being stored in the brain. They've never found it there.
Right.
And so it just made sense to me that memory could be stored in the subconscious, right? I mean, and because when we look at the reincarnation cases, when we'll get to all the facets of them, but one of them, of course, is past life memory, right?
Right.
And if you've got past life memory, that can't be in the brain because the brain's gone. The previous brain is gone. If the memories are stored in the subconscious, and the subconscious then survives death along with the rest of the consciousness, then what can happen is that in reincarnation is just like a possession of the body by that consciousness, right? And then the memories are still there in the subconscious, and it's just a matter of bringing them up, how you bring them up to conscious awareness again and again. But it's not just memories that are in the subconscious. I think personality traits, I think behavioral dispositions, I think all of everything that makes up personal identity is recorded in our subconscious, and that's how it gets carried over to the next life.
This stream of consciousness that you call it. Well, we see that in the near death experience. They're out of their body, but they still have this cognizant memory of things and of what is going on in the present. So is this why I think the strongest cases for reincarnation are with the children? To me, it's a really unique situation when a child at age 2 begins to have memories and they begin to verbalize things that a normal child would not, specific things that they say happened in a former life. And you did a study in your great book, Signs of Reincarnation. And tell us about that. Tell us why you think that the children's memories of reincarnation are the strongest.
Well, it's important to realize that adults have these memories too, but the children's are stronger. And why? So the young children, as soon as they start to speak, that they start saying these things, whenever their first words can be something that turns out later. Now, it'll take them a little while to be able to speak articulately, and so gradually they say more and more. But yeah, I mean, ages 2 and 3 are the most common ages for these memories to begin. And children who begin at that age, that early, they remember things more clearly. They remember things more strongly. They say more things. These things that they say, incredibly, can be traced to people who were deceased. And this is what Stevenson was on to, right? And why he went to India and Ceylon in 1961, because he was reading about these cases and then he heard about them through correspondence. So he went to investigate these cases himself. And one of the things about the children's cases, particularly in Asia, is that the past lives were normally lived close by in the same country normally. The young children not only have these memories, they have the emotions to go along with the memories. And so they demand of their parents to be taken back. And the parents just get tired of being asked again and again and again to go back to my home, my real home.
Yes, yes.
And they oblige very often. Yes. And they take the kids back to where the kids say they were. And the kids then go their way to their previous homes. They recognize people and all of this stuff. And once you've done that, though, once you know who the previous person was, And you can compare that person to the child, and you start seeing that it's more than memories. It's behaviors, it's personality, it's all of this stuff that gets carried over too. But you can't see that until you've solved, as we say, solved the case. That is, identified the previous person.
Some of these things are stunning. I know in Stevenson's book, he talks about children going back and saying, oh, I buried some gold in the backyard or under the house. And they're like, oh, yeah, right. And then they dig in.
Yeah, find it. Yeah.
Yes, verifiable things. And that leads us to, in Stevenson's work, where over 70%, they call, of these cases, and they did 2,500 cases, were solved, which means there were verifiable autopsies or relatives or that would verify these children's stories that were really quite stunning. And they weren't just general observations. They were specific, like you said,
Very
specific names. Amazing. And you did a great study on the young girl that came back, O'Bannon, Rylan O'Bannon.
Yeah, Rylan O'Bannon, yeah.
From Jennifer Schultz's, who was killed in the Pan Am American Flight 759. And your research on that is amazing. Like there were verifiable facts that these families, and another thing I think is fascinating is the parents in that case, and then also in two others that we can talk briefly about, the sole survivor and the boy who knew too much.
You've done your homework.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent.
Now, this is such a fascinating topic, but the parents discourage this because they don't want. Their either religious background tells them that this can't be true. So they discourage these children from talking about this. But after a while, it is just so, for instance, in this little JamesLeininger, he had so many specific, he said he was a World War II pilot. He knew the name of the plane and the aircraft carrier, and even the name of the person who he served with that they later found. I mean, some of this stuff is, you just can't make it up. It's so amazing.
No, I mean, one of the things I really like about that, he was given these G.I. Joe dolls, right? He named them, but the names he gave those were of flyers from the same aircraft carrier who predeceased him. He said he remembered meeting them when he got to heaven.
Oh, that gives me the shivers. Wild. I think if a scientist goes into this topic with an open mind, and I know there have been a lot of skeptics, especially with this little JamesLeininger, that tried to disprove it, but they just can't. I mean,
they just can't. Yeah, they just can't.
Like when he was, was he 2, that father took him to an aircraft museum, and this little boy knew everything about these fighter. At 2 or whatever,
yeah,
you just can't make this stuff up, like you said.
I know. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's true. I mean, and what the skeptics like to say, his father took him there and that's what suggested all this to him. But no, I mean, the reason the father took him to him is he was already fascinated in the things.
Right.
And
yes.
This was a case that was investigated it was originally written by the family, but then it was investigated by Jim Tucker, who at the University of Virginia, who was Stevenson's successor there. But one of the things that the skeptics like to say is that the kid, JamesLeininger, he made a mistake in saying that he died in a Corsair. He had trained on Corsairs, so that is the previous person. He'd also named James. And the previous James had trained on a Corsair. So it was important to him, but he had died in a different type of aircraft. Well, the skeptics found out that at the museum that the father took him to, there was a Corsair. So they tried to say, okay, so he saw the Corsair, and that's what gave him the idea that he died in a Corsair. Well, so Jim Tucker calls the museum because he interviewed the family and all that. And the family told him there wasn't a Corsair there when we went. So Jim Tucker called the museum, and sure enough, there was not a Corsair there at the museum when they went. So the whole skeptical thing falls apart.
Sure. You can understand they have their own worldview to sort of defend, I suppose. But yeah, I think an open-minded scholar has got to look at this stuff and really be stunned. So, Jim, how do you think that once this stream of consciousness, we leave this body, how do you think it reincarnates into a new physical body. Your take on that is wonderful. And it's a little different than, for instance, you don't go along with kind of the New Age thing where it says we go up to heaven and we plan out the next life or whatever, and we choose to learn lessons. That's not necessarily how you look at it. Tell us how you look at it.
Well, I go by the evidence, right? I go by the data. In about 20% of these cases, the kids will remember things that happened between their deaths and their births. Okay, we call that the intermission period. That's Stevenson's term, and just standard terminology for this. So about 20% of these cases, the kids remember the intermission period. And what they say about what happened, they do not talk about life planning. They do not talk about life reviews. They don't talk about setting goals. All of that sort of stuff, which is sort of the popular idea of reincarnation, is just not supported by the research. What we do see, though, is that many of them talk about choosing their parents. In fact, my daughter was one of those, and you read about her in the book, my daughter Christina. Yeah, my daughter Christina, when she was 3, she told her mother and me, she told us that she saw we were looking for a baby, and so she came to us. She, and that's how she put it. That suggests that my wife was already pregnant at the time, right? There was already a baby there, and we were waiting for somebody to come in and possess the baby, right? And so Christina saw that. I saw you and mommy were looking for a baby. For me, reincarnation is not something that necessarily happens at conception.
Okay. I was just going to ask you when you felt you, and I think I read you, it can happen at different times.
It can happen at different times, right? Like Christina, I mean, that's what she suggests. And I don't know how crazy we want to get, but it can even happen after birth with the replacement reincarnation, which makes sense if you accept reincarnation as a sort of possession. Because if all reincarnation is a possession of the body, then there's no reason why that possession should come only during gestation. Normally it does.
Right.
But there are a number of these cases where you have this replacement, right? Where the old personality leaves and a new one takes over. And that's why I call it replacement reincarnation, which makes sense if you understand reincarnation as being possession, but doesn't make sense if you think of reincarnation as having to come in conception.
So I have a question about you talked about the physical marks, the birthmarks, and even wounds or injuries. I've read that sometimes they find out if somebody's been shot in the chest, and these are a lot of times violent deaths, that there will be a bullet, like a birthmark, and they verify these. They find out, the scar that or the whatever killed this person. The next time around, this child is born with a scar. That's wild, isn't it?
It's totally wild. Yeah. Reading about these things at first, the psychological part of reincarnation, okay, maybe I was willing to. It took me years really to accept this physical part and to make sense of it. Writing the course lectures that became the book, that I really figured a lot of this stuff out, because I had to figure it out. If I'm going to teach this course, I need to understand it, right? I had to figure it out. And it was in writing the lectures then for the course that it came to me what was going on. I think all this physical stuff is psychogenic, which means that the mind is producing it. The mind or the subconscious, it could also be conscious, is aware of this, and it's important in the wound. It's anything of significance to the previous person. Earring birthmarks.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Earring birthmarks show up very often. Tattoos, scars that were healed by the time the person died. Anything that was of significance to the person can show up. And that makes sense, though, on a psychogenic level, where the mind then has taken this in, and the mind then is reproducing this on the new body. And once I realized that, then I understood it. And once I understood how it could happen and it made sense, then that skepticism went away. But I had to understand it first.
Right. And the phobias too that people have. I've been reading about past life regressions, and people will go back and figure out why they have maybe they're extremely claustrophobic or whatever. They're scared to death of drowning. And some of the little ones that start talking about reincarnation will talk about how they died. And then the parent goes, oh my gosh, that lines right up with
Yeah, phobia. Like if the kid drowned, is going to be afraid of water. One of Stevenson's cases from his first collection of case reports is of a kid who was murdered by having his throat slit. He had a birthmark, a linear birthmark across his throat. And this is the thing about these birthmarks. They are in the place. They resemble, in shape and in color very often whatever it is they're commemorating. Is crazy. In addition to the birthmark across his throat, this kid had a great fear of barbers, all barbers, and all washermen. Now, it turned out that the people who had slit his throat, one of them was a barber and one of them was a washerman. So he had sort of generalized this fear from that, but he had this great phobia then of people of those professions,
right.
Wow. But it just goes on and on. If you drown and you're afraid of water and this sort of thing.
So what do you think about people going back past life regressions to deal with that? What do you think about that?
Past life regression, I think, can be useful in therapy, but it's not useful in research. The reason it's not useful in research is that it's been shown over and over and over again that the things that come up under regression are unreliable.
Okay.
You can't trust them. Even with the spontaneous cases, you need to go back and you need to verify. You can't just, take everything that the kids say at face value, right? You need to verify it. Now, you very often can with the kids, the spontaneous memories, when it comes to these regressions. And most of these are not regressions of kids; they're regressions of adults. So right there's a difference. But with the regressions, very often you cannot verify them. When it comes to the therapy and helping relieve traumas and things like that, it can be very helpful because it doesn't really matter then, does it? It doesn't really matter if what you're remembering is accurate, literally accurate. What matters if it is portraying something in a way that your psyche can help you process.
Interesting. That makes sense. And the difference, too, to me, is the child reincarnation episodes that have been solved. This isn't just, we found one or two things that line up. In order to solve these, the researchers, there's a long list of things that they verify. Can you talk about that, like autopsies and on and on? What does it take to put a child reincarnation or any reincarnation in the solved category?
Let me use the example of Rylan from my book. Rylan started off being really a model child for her first year. Her parents had no problem with her at all. And then as she moved into her second year, really crazy stuff started happening. She started sleepwalking. Several times a week, she would sleepwalk, and she started wanting tags cut out of her shirt. She would complain it felt like her skin was burning. I believe it was when her mother was taking these pictures of the family. And there's a picture of Rylan outside in her yard with this awesome look on her face. She would just say, and after that, they could not get her to lighten up at all. She'd seen something that's horrible and she's standing in her yard. So after she got the prints back, the mother framed these little prints and put them in various places around the house, and she took some to her work. And this particular one she took to her work. Every time Rylan visited her mother in her office and saw this photo, she would tell her mother, I was bigger in that photo.
Was she holding a flower too? There was something she was holding.
Yeah, she was holding this. She was holding this flower. And that was part of the photograph. That was how they posed her in the photograph. So she's holding this big flower. But this didn't make any sense to her mother. What do you mean you're still free? How can you say you're bigger in this picture? The picture we just took. Don't you remember we just took this a month ago? What does this mean? So, but this went on for months. Every time she went into the office, she would say the same thing. It wasn't until she was 6 where her mother was reading her a good night story. She read the story and turned off the light. And so Rylan is lying there in the dark, and she says, "Mommy, do you remember that picture where I was bigger?" And she says, "I died." Rylan says, "I died." So finally, after all this time, memories are starting to come up. And then after that, she started saying more and more and more things. And she would talk about Jennifer without saying who Jennifer was, just mentioned the name Jennifer. Her brother once asked her where she thought she had died, and she said Louisiana. At first she thought she had died in her yard, a lightning strike. That's what she thought at first. But then later, when she's 6, she remembers it's a plane crash. And she also asked her mother at one point when her mother was born. Her mother was born in 1971. And so the date 1971 became significant somehow. So with the plane crash, her mother went to the internet, thought maybe she has enough clues now. So she put into Google 1971 plane crash in Louisiana. And that's when she found the Pan Am flight, the Pan Am one that hit. It wasn't in 1971. It was 1982, I believe, 82, 83. It was a Pan Am flight that took off from Kenner, Louisiana, which is where the Louisiana airport is. It's a suburb of New Orleans. And that's where the plane took off. And it hit a low altitude wind shear and came down and hit this residential neighborhood, less than a mile from the end of the runway. It killed everybody on the plane, obviously, but 6 people on the ground, one of whom was named Jennifer.
Wow. Yeah.
So suddenly, this starts coming in together. So when I'm interviewing her about this, she says something which she hadn't said before. And that is that she thought she was sitting in her carport on a swing, watching the plane come towards her. And she was talking on the telephone. And she was electrocuted, she said, over the telephone. This is what she told me at 10.
That's wild.
It took all this time for it to become clear enough for her to say that. Okay, so what do? My next step, after interviewing them, the next step is you go and you interview people on the other side, the previous side. So I went to Kenner. Her friends were still there, right? And I interviewed a lot of her friends. I interviewed her neighbors, and I went and got her autopsy report, Jennifer's. You have to imagine this, how devastating this was. The plane comes in, it took down 3 blocks, were totally gone. And so a huge debris field to go through. So Jennifer's body was not found at first because they were working on other houses and it took them a while to get there. But her house was on the first line that was hit. So it was one of the first ones hit. First of all, car swing in a carport. Now,
wow, that's specific stuff.
Very specific stuff and strange stuff. And I keep asking people, when I tell this story, I ask, how many of you have ever seen or heard of a swing in a carport? Because when she told me this, I said, are you sure it's not a porch swing? Are you sure it's not a swing in the yard? But no, she was adamant. She was sharp. It was a swing in a carport. When I was walking around Kenner, a house in the next block that was not hit had a swing in the carport.
Wow.
In that neighborhood, there were actually swings and carports. Okay, so in 1981, we don't have cell phones. So she's on the phone, and you have to imagine this phone, on a long cord coming out the kitchen door, right? The kitchen door and the carport. So you have to imagine that. But she's sitting on the phone, getting on the swing, talking on the phone, probably to a boy, but it was probably a boy, and that would sort of make sense why she's out of the house, And so she's sitting on the phone, out of the house, sitting on the carport swing, talking on the telephone, when she sees this plane come down, about to hit the house, coming right down.
Wow.
One of the things that I discovered is not only did the power lines run right in front of her house, because the pole is still there.
Wow.
The pole is still there with the power lines, but also the telephone lines ran actually below the power lines. And so there isn't any way that the plane, in coming and hitting the house, does not pass through the power lines and the phone lines. It's going to cut them. There's just no way it's not going to. Now, one of the things I learned, because I also talked to the person who did the autopsy report, and he's the person who actually told me that back then, the power lines in this neighborhood were not insulated. So if
Wow.
you could imagine, I mean, it's very possible that an uninsulated power line hit after it was cut, hit the telephone line, which is also cut, and that caused a charge to go up in the house, right? And so maybe she was electrocuted that way. Okay, so when I got, and remember, now none of the friends knew what happened to her. They imagined that the body must have been hit and carried, and there was somebody who told me, oh, the body was found in the swimming pool and all this. Nobody knew. Nobody knew. I read all the press reports, but you know how press is. The first day, it's headlines. By day 3, it's no longer of interest. They've moved on. The stories about this didn't know anything about where her body was found either, because it wasn't found for 3 days in. But the autopsy report said her body was found on the floor of the carport.
Wow. That's wild.
Furthermore, there was no smoke inhalation and no sign of discoloration of the blood. And what that means, she was dead by the time the plane got there.
Thank God. Huh.
And thank God. But how does that happen? It would happen if she was electrocuted.
Yeah. And where she says her neck, the burns on her neck, all
and
that.
It would make sense. It would make sense of that, you see.
Wow. Isn't that I bet that's just chilling.
Tied everything together. And here's this 10-year-old kid who is saying this, having just remembered it, where does this come from?
Yeah. And it's empirical proof. It's like,
yeah,
you can't argue with that. And I read that once these kids start to remember these experiences and they can process them, then these fears seem to sort of disappear, or at least they feel like they've worked through them. And I love that if you let them tell what happened and you deal with it, that then their nightmares seem to ease up. The thing that I love when I read and that Dolores Cannon, I think, works with children who have past life memories. And when she's able to talk to them, some of their phobias, their fears, their nightmares, and we saw this with JamesLeininger, they disappear. And so I just think that's so wonderful that, once these kids can process some of this stuff, and then it seems like they say, okay, like the parent will say, well, that was in your other life. And, once they all become honest, that was in your other life. You have a new body now. You don't have to worry about this. It's so heartwarming to know that then these kids can go on with this life and live full lives.
Yeah, that's right. Validating the memories is so important, right? You're not dismissing them, and and part of that is getting to some point of closure.
Yes,
because it's not always possible, really, to solve a case. I mean, some cases remain unsolved, but you still have these elements. You still have the phobia and all that, and so with those, it's really important to sort of. To say we believe you, right?
Yes.
And to
Yes.
validate them in that way, and assure them that life was past and they're now in a different life, and they can let all that go.
And I can see too I read these accounts where the parents are so distraught because they think that reincarnation would be heresy, go against their religious beliefs or whatever. And once they, I believe, start putting the child's welfare above maybe something they've been taught in a doctrine or whatever, they're able to accept the child's story. That to me is so important, that if you believe this child, then they can process it. I mean, some of them have been told, well, your child's demon possessed, or whatever craziness. And that's so beautiful to me that people like you and people that work with children who've had these experiences can help people to understand and accept and live full lives in this life.
Well, a lot of these families, I mean, they go through the process themselves. I mean, like Ryland's family did. I mean, they didn't know what was going on. They're a Catholic family. I mean, they had no basis, for believing in reincarnation, and it was Ryland's experiences and that made them accept it, and believe it, And JamesLeininger's father particularly, I mean, his parents, they were fundamentalist Christians. His mother came to accept it sooner than his father did. But his father was the one who was so doggedly, researched this thing until he finally got to the point where he just had to accept it. And so it's that they're brought to accepting.
That's lovely. Jim, I'd like to ask you about the online course that you teach, Signs of Reincarnation. And this is the textbook for it, which is a fabulous book. And I loved every chapter, every bit of it. And so tell us about when you started it and why, but give us a little background about your online course.
It's a 15-week course, first of all. I start with the beliefs in reincarnation, and then the history and the background and how the cases are researched, and then review all of the research data and then theory. And the subtitle is Exploring Beliefs, Cases, and Theory. And 15 weeks allowed me to do that, to focus on the memories, the behaviors, and the physical things separately. By doing that, I could then see that the memories are very much like regular memories of this life. And so the very same concepts that are used to talk about and research this life memory can be used very effectively in talking about past life memory. And the same comes with the behaviors. You can use, procedural memories is what the term for behavior memories, right? And the contrast between declarative memories, which are, the memories that we talk about.
Memories that are maybe imprinted on the psyche that.
Well, behaviorally. Things that aren't declarative. Things like emotional memories and behavioral memories and things like that, and skills and this type of thing, which is clearly a memory, right? But it's not a declarative memory. Those memories, those also, line up perfectly, with the types of things that we see in the reincarnation cases. By treating them separately in separate units in the course, it allowed me really to focus on them in a way that hadn't been done before, frankly, and figure a lot of things out that hadn't really been thought through, figured out carefully before. So the book is based on the course lectures, but that was important, right? Because in the course of teaching it over and over and over again, I honed a lot of this stuff. I learned how to say things and not say things and what people wanted to know, and all that probably made it a better book.
It's a great book. So I want to end with a question I have for you that I kept thinking about as I was reading your wonderful research. What do you think is the purpose of coming back, like the stream of consciousness being, maybe you would say eternal, or is our stream of consciousness personal? And if it is, why do we come back over and over?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really important question. It's a good one to end on, too. If we think about when reincarnation could have begun, the most reasonable time to me, when life began. Why would it begin with humans, right? It makes much more sense that if it has to do with consciousness, it began when consciousness began. Mm-hmm. And when did consciousness begin? When life began. And so that pushes consciousness and reincarnation back to the beginnings. And we now know, scientists working with, single cell things like bacteria can see that they can learn. There are people now who are saying, that consciousness does go back to bacteria. So if consciousness began then, and if we know that life has evolved all these millions of years, probably consciousness has too. Okay. And I think consciousness has evolved to work with the body, right? Work with the brain and the body of each particular species. And so one of the things that I hypothesize really is that reincarnation is probably species specific. We reincarnate in a given species. And it's still an open question about transmigration. That's the distinction I make. Reincarnation is in species lines, transmigration is across species. Now, it's at some point, at some level, yeah.
During the evolutionary process.
During the evolutionary process, there has to be crossover. So probably the issue is if two species are close enough.
Right.
Physically, and then we can also think about, in a biological sense, whether they can interbreed and produce viable offspring. And so there again, so perhaps we want to say, if two species are close enough to produce viable offspring, their consciousness is probably close enough. I mean, we can suggest things like that maybe can be tested in the future. In order to answer this question, what reincarnation is about, I think we need to take this long view. I think we need to understand reincarnation as being really about the term I like to use is conservation of consciousness. I don't think consciousness is energy. Energy to me means something physical. And I don't think consciousness is physical. I think it's its own thing. But I think there's a conservation of consciousness in the same way there's a conservation of energy. So that when the body ceases to be viable, then consciousness just continues. And I think reincarnation is probably as natural as life and death is. And so the purpose of reincarnation may be just to continue and continue and continue and continue.
Evolution of the species, maybe, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's part of the evolution of the species. And it's possible that reincarnation even has something to do with that evolution of the species. Because if the consciousness is existing outside of the body, perhaps, and can influence the body like we know it can with the birthmarks, birth defects, and physically, maybe it can influence it in other ways and help guide the physical evolution.
I absolutely think that could be a real possibility, because the brain is evolving and changing, but maybe when it is imbued with this consciousness that is evolving, it forces that biological brain to, like the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, to move forward, to evolve. But Jim, one of the things I love about your research is you use incredibly solid empirical evidence, and you say, but let's be open. We don't know about some of these things, but let's explore them with an open mind and be willing to change our paradigms. And I think that's so important in this academic world right now. So yeah, I applaud your work, and it's really fascinating and it's wonderful. And I would love maybe to take your class someday. It sounds like just an incredible class. And also I want to say that I found Jim online, a Facebook group that is really vibrant and wonderful group of people. And you also approach this issue with an open mind, and people dialogue about what their experiences and about their beliefs. So thank you for that. That's such an important platform for us today to have.
Well, thank you. Well, let's give people the name of it. If they're on Facebook, the name of the group is Science of Reincarnation. I really like that. But the subtitle is different. It's called Experiences and Research. And it's exactly that. You know, it's people's experiences, and then with the admins. And this is an unusual thing to try to do on Facebook. But from the beginning, I've wanted to make this an educational group. And so from the beginning, I and other admins try to respond to every post from a research point of view. Now, people go on and talk about, from theirs, but we try to keep it so within bounds and not get too wacky, right? Not too new agey. So it's still a research, but it's growing. We've got over 200,000 members now.
It's wild. That's so cool.
It's totally wild.
And all over the world.
And that's the great thing about social media. It's all over the world. So anybody who's interested in this, and if you're on Facebook, if you're not on Facebook and you're interested in joining this, come to Facebook and find us. But Science of Reincarnation is called.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. It's been so delightful to talk to you today, and thank you again for your research and your work. And it is important in this world. So, thanks again.
Well, thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining me today for my interview with Dr. Jim Matlock. If you'd like to know more about Jim's research, go to my website, haveyourwonderedpodcast.com, and look under Again.
Have you ever wondered? Ever